Hello. Today our lecture deals with blood circulation, and here on this page you could see the content of our lectures with different parts. So the first part uh, is rheological properties of blood. Firstly, let's talk about rheology. Rheology is a scientific discipline that examines mechanical properties of continuous media. This discipline is also called mechanics of a continuum. From the medical point of view, it focuses on the physical properties of blood. And to achieve a detailed understanding of the physiological processes in the cardiovascular system, it is necessary to understand both the biophysical properties of blood and its interaction with the system of blood vessels. So, vascular system can be divided in functional systems of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. So, arteries distribute blood under the high pressure throughout the entire body. They are morphologically adapted to suit this purpose. Arteries have thick, muscle-rich walls. There is about 13% of the total blood volume in the arteries. Arterioles. Arterioles are the smallest branches of the arteries. Their role consists in controlling the flow of blood into the capillary system. This is achieved by an action of muscle cells in their walls. In particular, they attenuate fluctuating changes in a blood pressure, thus making its value constant. Action of the arterioles prevents damaging the microcirculation. Arterioles and small arteries are known as resistance vessels because they form a main portion of a peripheral resistance valve. Capillaries. Exchange of nutrients, electrolytes, and respiratory gases takes place in the capillaries. This exchange is based on the Stalin forces. There is only 7% of the total blood volume in capillaries, but this portion is sufficient enough to provide nutrition to an entire organism. Venules. Venules collect the blood from capillaries and then merge into large veins. And veins. System of veins is often called a low pressure system or a capacitance system due to its function as a blood reservoir. Apart from its blood reservoir function, blood flows back to the heart through veins. There is about 15% of total blood volume in the veins. Each of these systems must be regarded as a separate functional system, which is serially connected to the next one. To simplify a description of the events occurring in these systems, so-called cross-sectional area has been introduced. Cross-sectional area in sum of all vascular cross-section in a specific functional system. Velocity of blood flow is directly related to a minute blood flow in a specific system and inversely related to a cross-sectional area. So, if we know these three following facts, first, minute blood flow value that applies to the entire circulation, 5 liters per minute. Second, cross-sectional area of aorta is about 2.5 square centimeters. And third, cross-sectional area of the capillaries is up to 2,500 square centimeters. Then it is clear that the velocity of blood flow is about 100-fold slower in capillaries. Next, let's talk about blood flow, pressure, and resistance. Blood flow is a value indicating a degree of a motion in the blood vessel. It is expressed as a unit of volume per unit of time, most commonly liters per minute. Concept of the blood flow is similar to a concept of electric current. Electric current indicates the degree of movement electrically charged particles in the conductor. Although the similarity, there is a few differences. Let's talk about pressure gradient. Pressure gradient is a difference between the pressures at the beginning and the end of the vessel. It is the measured course of a blood flow in the entire body. In general, liquids move from an area with high pressure value to an area with low pressure value. Thus, the main function of the heart is to generate a pressure gradient. The same principle underlines the electric current. There is an electric voltage instead of a pressure gradient. In fact, voltage is nothing else than a difference between the electric potential at beginning and at the end of a wire. Next, vascular resistance. As it is true for electric current, the blood flow is inversely proportional to the resistance. Resistance of blood vessels depends on a number of factors which will be discussed a little later. Thus, we can apply Ohm's law in a case of blood vessel as well as in case of an electric wire, where F is a blood flow, delta P pressure gradient, P first minus P second, and R resistance of a vascular system. Blood flow. The movement of blood in the vessel can be expressed as a flux. Flux is a purely quantitative value indicating a volume of blood passing through a vessel per a unit of time. Flux is a scalar. Another point of view is to describe blood flow qualitatively. Flow can be either laminar or turbulent. So let's talk firstly about laminar flow. Laminar flow occurs in the straight parts of arteries which intact endothelium. For every 2 points in the flowing volume of blood, there is a flow line. Flow lines are curves which lie in parallel with the blood flow vector. According to definition, flow lines never crosses. Thus, there are neither wheels or verticals in laminar flow. So you could see that this is a direct line. Laminar flow is characterized by parabolic velocity profile. This means that there are the fastest molecules flowing in the center of vessels. Here, values of velocity decrease in a direction to vessel surface from center to walls. Explanation of this phenomenon is quite simple. There is a friction of vessel walls. Molecules slowed by a contact with the endothelium are in turn slowing those flowing next to them. to turbulent flow. Turbulent flow occurs whenever the velocity of the flowing blood is too high, the vessel is narrowed, or there is an obstacle in the lumen of a vessel. There is a wheels and verticals in the stream of flowing blood. If the flow becomes turbulent, there is a significant increase in vascular resistance and the value of blood flow decreases. An exact way to calculate a value for which the flow becomes turbulent doesn't exist. Um, but we can determine a probability of turbulent flow occurrence. Rate of probability is called Reynolds number, where Reynolds number, V velocity of blood flow, D diameter of blood vessels, ρ density of blood, eta viscosity. Let's move on vascular resistance. No direct method for measuring vascular resistance exists. It can be calculated from a pressure differences and a blood flow. It's expressed in peripheral resistance units. Vessel have a resistance 1 peripheral resistance units if pressure gradient of 1 millimeter of mercury causes a blood flow of 1 milliliter second. In literature, peripheral resistance unit is sometimes called Wood's unit. So, vascular resistance is physiologically given by a variety of factors. Both friction and vascular constriction contribute. Vascular resistance is physiologically regulated by degree of constriction. Higher the constriction, higher the resistance. Arteriolar constriction is the crucial factor in determination of peripheral resistance value. Let's talk about total vascular resistance. So to calculate the resistance of the entire system circulation, we ratiocinate blood flow as cardiac output 100 milliliters per second. Pressure difference between the aorta and superior vena cava is about 100 millimeters of mercury. According to Ohm laws, total vascular resistance equals one peripheral resistance units. This value differs according to a different physiological conditions. It can be as high as 4 peripheral resistance units or as low as 0.2 peripheral resistance units. Let's move to conductance. Conductivity, indicates how easily blood flows through the vessel at a certain pressure gradient. In fact, it is constant of proportionally. You could see this first proportion. This implies that the conductance is a reciprocal value of resistance. Conductivity allows us to describe phenomena where the vascular resistance would be less clear. Let's talk about viscosity. Viscosity is a value that characterizes an internal friction of a fluid. It primarily depends on the attractive forces between particles. Under physiological conditions, the viscosity of the blood of about threefold higher than the viscosity of water. Viscosity of blood is directly related to the number of red blood cells, uh, in other words, hematocrit. Blood pressure. Then the storm, you know the storm from our practical class about measurement of blood pressure, and I hope that you remember this procedure of measuring of blood pressure. But I want to repeat you about this general. Um, about this general parameter, about this general procedure. So when we speak of blood pressure, we usually refer to the blood pressure in the systemic circulation. And when the left ventricle of the heart overcomes the blood pressure in the large arteries, the aortic valve opens. Aortic pressure reaches its maximum, which is called the systolic pressure. Then aortic valve closes and blood pressure falls to its minimum, so-called diastolic pressure. The difference between these two is known as the pulse pressure. So I think you remember that pulse is the wave of blood. Yes? The most important parameter of evaluation of blood flow efficiency is the mean pressure, which is an average value of pressure during whole cardiac cycle. And speak a little about measurement of blood pressure. Blood pressure can measure directly or indirectly. Direct measurement of blood pressure is done by an introduction of the cannula to the bloodstream. The most common approaches are based on introductions of cannula to a radial artery, bronchial artery, or femoral artery. In routine blood pressure measurement, there is a standard auscultation method or Riva-Rossi method. An inflatable curve wrapped around the arm. So the tool for measuring of blood pressure is a stethoscope and manometer. So um, a sphygmomanometer has a cuff, um, has a bulb, and stethoscope for listening sounds. So the cuff is inflated to a pressure value just above the expected systolic blood pressure value. And this point, the brachial artery closes as a result of a high pressure applied by a cuff. Thus, examiner hears no sound during the auscultation. Pressure of the inflatable cuff is slowly released. When the systolic pressure in the artery exceeds the pressure in the cuff, whooshing or pounding noises can be heard. I hope you remember about first Korotkov sound. The pressure at which these noises are first heard, heard is the systolic blood pressure measured by a high over column of mercury. This sound phenomenon is called Korotkov sound, and it indicates a turbulent flow in the brachial artery. The cuff pressure is further released until no sound can be heard, indicating the diastolic arterial pressure. So when sound appears, this is the oh, I'm sorry, when the sound disappears, this is the last Korotkov sound, and this is the sign of diastolic pressure. And now let's talk about blood flow in our organs. Firstly, talk about cerebral blood flow. 15% of the cardiac output enters the brain because of high oxygen demand. Also, brain represents only 2% of total body weight. It requires up to 20% of the total oxygen supply. Oxygen is utilized particularly in its gray matter. Oxygenated blood enters the brain through two internal carotid arteries and two vertebral arteries. Vertebral arteries merge forming a basilar artery. Basilar artery and internal carotid arteries connect to other forming a circle of Willis. Six great arteries arises from the circle of Willis. These supply the brain cortex, providing oxygenated blood. Deoxygenated blood is collected by deep veins that enters internal jugular veins. Regulation of cerebral blood flow. Cerebral blood flow is strictly regulated. It must be maintained whatever it takes during all variable conditions. It is affected by the arterial and venous pressure, as well as the blood viscosity and the degree of constriction of the brain arterioles. Coronary blood flow. Coronary blood flow here is about 250 milliliters per minute at resting conditions. Myocardium is supplied by two coronary arteries. They arise from aorta just above the aortic valve. Left coronary artery supplies the front portion of the septum, the conduction system, and the major portion of the left ventricle. The right coronary artery supplies majority of right ventricle, a portion of the septum, and the posterior wall of the left ventricle. Large subepicardial branches into the myocardium. The ends subendocardially as capillaries. Only a thin layer of cardiac muscle just beneath the endocardium is oxygenated directly by diffusion of oxygen from the blood within the chambers of the heart. Pulmonary blood flow. 100% of cardiac output flows through the low-pressure pulmonary circulation. The pulmonary circulation is anatomically unique at the level of the microcirculation. Arterioles and venules are shorter but have a larger diameter and richly anastomosed. Mean pressure in a pulmonary artery is about 15 millimeters of mercury. Thus, pressure in this pulmonary circulation is significantly lower than blood pressure in systemic circulation. Let's talk about regulation of pulmonary blood flow. Regulation of the pulmonary blood flow is mediated by our local metabolites, oxygen and carbon dioxide in particular. In the lungs, they induce an opposite effects as they want in other tissues. Hypoxia as well as increase in the um, carbon dioxide causes vasoconstriction through the inhibition of different production in the endothelial cells. This blood is redistributed in way which allows best ventilation with perfusion ratio. Renal blood flow. About 25% of the cardiac output passes through the kidneys. Most of the blood, about 90%, flows through the renal cortex. Each kidney is supplied by a renal artery. This artery arises from the aorta. It divides into 2-3 branches before entering the renal cortex. One branch supplies the upper portion of a kidney, another the middle portion, and the last one of the lower portion. Furthermore, this branch divides into the interlobular arteries, which give rise to an afferent arterioles. Blood flows to glomerulus through the afferent arterioles. Blood is collected by interlobular veins, then passes to the arcuate veins, from those continue to the interlobar veins, which finally merges into the renal vein. Skeletal muscle blood flow. About 25% of cardiac output passes through a skeletal muscles under the resting conditions, but it can be as high as 90% of cardiac output during heavy exercise. So skeletal muscle blood flow regulation. Let's talk about it then. Autonomic nervous system regulates the blood flow in skeletal muscle. Activation of alpha-1 adrenergic receptors via noradrenaline causes vasoconstriction, thus increases the vascular resistance and reduces the blood flow. Activation of B2 adrenergic receptors via adrenaline induces vasodilatation. Vasodilatation is also induced by local metabolites, especially the lactate, adenosine, and potassium. Let's talk about skin blood flow. Skin is one of the most important organ in thermoregulation, so that human body possesses, and about 5% of cardiac output passes through skin. On the sympathetic nervous system invades skin vessels. Both adrenaline and noradrenaline cause vasoconstriction. Despite this fact, vessels over the skin dilate during heavy exercise. This phenomenon is a response to an increase of body temperature, a reflex that is controlled by hypothalamic thermoregulatory centers. Local vasodilator agents include histamine and bradykinin. On the other hand, serotonin and substance P are potent vasoconstrictors. And the last part of our lecture deals with regulation of blood flow. The fundamental task that is shared by all regulatory mechanisms is to provide an adequate blood supply to the whole organism under constantly changing external and internal conditions. This difficult task is achieved by a change in vessel diameter. So, local regulatory mechanism is autoregulation. Autoregulation is an ability of the individual tissues to regulate its local blood flow according to the mechanism of action and can be divided into myogenic and metabolic and hormonal regulatory mechanisms. These are vasoconstriction hormones. So vasoconstrictor hormones include vasopressin, noradrenaline, adrenaline, and angiotensin II. And vasodilator hormones. This group includes kinins, histamine, um, natriuretic peptides, and partly adrenaline. And third, neuronal regulatory mechanism. Neural regulation of blood flow is mediated through a sympathetic portion of autonomic nervous system. Noradrenaline is the main vasoactive substance, acting through alpha-1 receptor. Sympathetic system is distinguished by a tone of a certain frequency which can be modified according to the needs of organism. Thus, the degree of constriction depends on the current sympathetic tone. By decreasing the sympathetic tone, vasodilatation is induced and vice versa. So, I think uh, that now we could finish and we could follow on the next lecture class.